What do you make of the aggressive rhetoric of Emmanuel Macron and others European leaders?
I think one of the problems or one of the revelations of this war was the European Union. And European Union member leaders, like including France, French leader Emmanuel Macron, and they kind of basically they made the European Union kind of more belligerent now and more kind of pro-war than even the United States now under Donald Trump.
What do you make of Zelensky's proposal to meet Vladimir Putin in Istanbul this Thursday?
I think Zelensky accepted this offer of Putin of direct talks between Ukraine and Russia um, only because
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, a political science professor at the University of Ottawa, Ivan Katchanovski, to discuss the Ukraine-Russia war. Have you ever wondered what the causes are of the war in Ukraine? What the implications are? Why there might be different causes and effects that we have anticipated so far, and how to think and really resolve the conflict in a way that might be productive and constructive for both parties. If you are interested in this fascinating conversation with Professor Ivan Katchanovski, join us now. Welcome, Ivan Katchanovski, to the show. It's such a honor to have you to discuss the Ukraine-Russia war.
thank you for the invitation. It is a pleasure to discuss on this show since I researched this topic for a very long time and have academic publications and have a new book which will be also published on this topic. So this is very important issue also right now if you based on the news of the latest developments which I also follow very closely. So this is I think a very crucial issue and very important topic to discuss. So thank you.
First and foremost, who is Professor Katchanovski in simply one powerful sentence?
I'm a Ukrainian and Canadian professor who specializes in research in conflicts and the politics of Ukraine since I wrote my PhD dissertation, and I specialize in this area for a very long time. So this is basically my background. But if anybody is interested, they can find my publications, books, and articles, and other publications, popular publications, media interviews on my websites, on my Twitter or X account, and other websites.
You published recently a book called The Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, the mass killing that changed the world, published by Paul Macmillan in 2024. What initiated you to write this book in the first place?
I specialize in researching political violence and conflicts in Ukraine. Since I wrote my PhD dissertation on this topic at George Mason University in the United States in 2001. Actually, I defended my dissertation one day before 9/11 happened. Terrorist attacks happened, and so I specialize in this topic and I research all the major conflicts in Ukraine, violent conflicts in Ukraine since um, Stalin's great terror in the um, first half of 20th century, and I examined all violence, all conflicts. And so for me, this was very natural and important to study violence which took place during Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. And I was watching this massacre happening live. And this was very important case of political violence because this massacre, this mass murder, which was televised basically live. I was watching this live when it happened from Canada. So this led to violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, and this escalated into further conflicts. This led to Russian response in terms of annexing Crimea, which was a pro-Russian region in southern Ukraine. This also led to or escalated into civil war and Russian military interventions in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, and this ultimately led to the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is also became a proxy war between West and Russia in Ukraine. So this is a very important case of political violence to research, and I studied this from the start when it was taking place, and I researched this massacre for more than now 11 years, and I still doing this. I still research this new developments which taking place, including very important decisions which were issued by Ukrainian judges and courts based on the trial just in the last months and also last 2 years, 2 years ago.
Why do you think it is particularly important now that we understand the Maidan massacre in order to get a grasp of the underlying issues that potentially caused the Russian invasion in Ukraine?
Thing is, this is important to understand origins of the conflicts without understanding actually how this conflict started, how this war was basically kind of initiated, which which is started like with Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. But this conflict going back to 2014, which is the Maidan, and this was the start of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which, as I mentioned, escalated subsequently, and. And this is, I think, very important to understand the origins of this war because media and politicians they often do not talk about this. They just ignore this massacre. They deny this massacre any involvement of any other actors in this massacre, with exception of government forces, which is standard narrative promoted by all major mainstream media, with some notable exceptions. And also, this is massacre is very important to understand not only these conflicts, but also to help to resolve this war, to have a peaceful resolution of the war in Ukraine and conflict in Ukraine, because without understanding this, the start of this conflict, hidden origins of this conflict, it's not possible actually, or would be very difficult actually to resolve this war and end this war and resolve conflict in Ukraine peacefully and to have again understanding what actually happened during this war and this massacre which took place in 2014.
And you pose the question in your book, which parties of the conflict massacred Maidan protesters and the police, which really sounds very provocative because most of the people, they think that it was the government, the Yanukovych government, who massacred these protesters and also the police. So what challenges did you personally encounter when you started researching and ultimately came up with a thesis, with an argument that may go by and large against the mainstream?
I was asking this question actually, who perpetrated Maidan massacre since after it ended. So I asked the same question at University of Ottawa, my university academic seminars in which I participated. I asked the same question in academic conferences which I attended, and I published my peer-reviewed journal articles based on the same research question, and I published a book which is open access book also based on this question, trying to answer this question, because as a scholar, I need to rely on evidence. And I cannot just accept for granted what politicians say, what government officials say happen, or what the media tell us happen. So I need to look into evidence. This is like evidence-based political science, like you would have in evidence-based medicine, not just relying on some kind of claims without any evidence. And since I was watching this massacre taking place live, immediately I noticed that there was discrepancy how this mass murder was reported by the media, by the governments, and what I saw myself. I was watching live all these television, internet streams and television broadcasts. But next day, when I wanted to examine them, to go back to view them as I did many days before during the Maidan violence which taken place in Kiev, I was not able to find this footage. It basically disappeared. So the most important live streams from the massacre, they disappeared from websites which were not only Ukrainian websites, but also from websites which were uh, 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 again a website of Radio Liberty or Radio Svoboda, which is U.S. government-funded uh, media organization. And so this they disappeared, and this was very strange because when I was watching this footage, you saw basically violence by the kind of by you have violence, you have of both sides, you have clashes, but they were not using live ammunition, and then suddenly you see Maidan activists being killed, police members being killed, and at the same time, the media coverage of this massacre was that this was basically fault of the police. They ignore completely shooting and killing of police members at the start of this massacre. Even so, I was watching this live, and footage disappeared, and afterwards you have shooting of the Maidan activists. But you have also footage shown by of police members shooting with Kalashnikov rifles, and this was presented basically as definite evidence that they were responsible for this massacre. But if when you watch this footage, and I am very familiar with the area in this where this massacre took place because I was student in Kiev, I visited the same area for very long time. For years, and I stayed in the Hotel Ukraina, which was location of snipers who shot Maidan activists. So I knew the area very well, and I saw, based on the footage and my knowledge, that the time when police was shooting with live ammunition did not coincide with time and location when specific Maidan activists were killed. So this was not actually evidence that police were shooting. There was lack of such evidence, and then I saw basically immediately all this Maidan kind of narrative promoted as basically as a fact accomplished, basically as a proven fact, even so there was no such evidence. And afterwards you have appearance of variety of evidence, like a phone call between Estonian foreign minister and head of European Union, foreign affairs for European Union, in which they discuss information that there was involvement of Maidan opposition in this massacre. So I decided to do research, to do academic research. I collected all available data, videos of this massacre in different languages. I examined witness testimonies. I examined the Maidan massacre trial and investigation videos, which were presented at the Ukrainian trial, which was taking place since 2015 and ended in 2023. So I look into Maidan Massacre trial verdict decision, which was issued uh, by the jury basically and judges who conducted this trial, and this was 1 million long text of this verdict. So I look into all this evidence, and based on this evidence, I did my research, and this is very different because nobody else did this research. They just rely on kind of on narratives which are promoted by the governments and the media without actually looking into evidence if this is actually based on evidence or not.
So now to go a little bit back, because we have to ask the question, and you mentioned it, that to some extent there are two actors. On one hand, Russia. On the other hand, you have the West. And to some extent, we understand it in a way that it's almost like a proxy war But we have to go back. What happened, especially in the 90s, when the Cold War ended? What were the legacies that we still can see today and that potentially led the to the push out of Yanukovych, which is pro-Russian? And also, I would like you to really tell us what we mean when we say pro-Russian or anti-Russian. So Yanukovych was a pro-Russian president, and he was democratically elected by the Ukrainian people.
Yes, and I examine also Ukrainian politics and conflicts and elections and public opinion in Ukraine going back to 1990s. And now I also finished writing a book, encyclopedic book of Ukraine since independence in 1991. So based on my research, I can say that there was a clear division in Ukraine between Western Ukraine and to a lesser extent Central Ukraine, which includes capital of Ukraine, Kyiv city, and Eastern and Southern Ukraine. And I'm originally from Western Ukraine, and these regions are very kind of nationalistic, pro-Western in terms of their orientation, while Eastern Ukraine and Central and Southern Ukraine are historically pro-Russian regions, and they supported pro-Russian candidates in all elections since 2000, since 1991 until 2014, when there were major pro-Russian parties, including Party of Region, led by Viktor Yanukovych, who was elected as president of Ukraine before Maidan, and also Communist Party of Ukraine. They were basically prohibited. So after and elections became not a free and fair, as relatively as even so they were before, relatively free and fair compared to what happened since 2014, since Maidan. So in all of these elections, there was a clear conflict or kind of or potential conflict, cleavage between Western Ukraine, which was very pro-Russian, pro-Western region, sorry, pro-nationalistic, pro-Western region, and pro-Russian regions, pro-communist regions in eastern and southern Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass, especially these two regions. And based on my research, based on my dissertation and my book, which I published in Germany by academic press, I call this cleft countries. This division goes back to history because Western Ukraine used to be part of Poland, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Romania, and Czechoslovakia until World War II, until World War One, while Eastern and Eastern and southern Ukraine was historically linked to Russia. It used to be part of the Russian Empire and had a very significant Russian minority and Russian majority population in Crimea. So in this case, there was kind of potential for conflict in Ukraine because Ukraine was regionally divided as one of the most divided countries along regional lines in the world, and also many people in eastern and southern Ukraine also spoke Russian. Most of them spoke Russian, while people in western and to a lesser extent central Ukraine were speaking Ukrainian language as a main language or native language. So there was such also language division, but the most important divisions were political divisions, and this conflict manifested themselves itself also during Maidan, because majority of Maidan activists and protesters who were taking part in anti-Yanukovych demonstrations were actually from Western Ukraine and to a lesser extent from Central Ukraine, including Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, but in Eastern and Southern Ukraine there was very big support for Maidan based on public opinion polls and based on size of pro-Maidan demonstrations, and there was also strong anti-Maidan movement. And Yanukovych, he was originally from Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, which is pro-Russian region, historically pro-Russian region, and he led Party of Regions. But Yanukovych was he described as pro-Russian president, and what it means, basically, what it means to be pro-Russian in Ukraine, according to my definitions and my articles, that they supported not basically they do not support the annexation of Ukraine by Russia. They do not support a common state with Russia, but they supported kind of economic union, basically similar to European Union, kind of with Russia, which was called Common Economic Space or Customs Union, led by Russia. So they supported also closer economic relations and closer political relations between Russia and Ukraine, but still remaining independent Ukraine. And they also supported, including Yanukovych, they supported basically also making Russian state second state language in Ukraine in addition to Ukrainian language. So this is what it meant to be a Russian politician. And but there were also some pro-Russian organizations which supported joining Russia, but these organizations were limited to Crimea. Especially in the 1990s, they wanted to join Russia, and they also there was a pro-Russian movement, kind of which was separatist movement in Donbas region of Ukraine, and this is what I also describe in my book and my dissertation and articles, that there was potential for a similar kind of conflict based on pro-Russian separatism, which actually happened since 2014 after overthrow Yanukovych. You have not only annexation of Crimea by Russia, but this region, majority of people supported actually joining Russia because they were ethnically Russian, and according to public opinion polls in Crimea, there was very strong support for joining Russia or independence from Ukraine. And Donbass, the same, a similar situation. I conducted public opinion poll. I commissioned public opinion poll in Ukraine in April and May 2014, and a majority of residents of Donbass supported different forms of separatism, including joining Russia or independence of Donbass or autonomy within Ukraine. So this is, I think, very important to understand that Ukraine was divided along regional lines between pro-Russian, pro-Western politicians, but this division did not mean necessarily that pro-Russian politicians wanted to kind of were against Ukrainian independence. They were like many of them were oligarchic politicians linked to oligarchs, very rich kind of businessmen and business persons who got their wealth because of the connection to the government, to the politics. And this is kind of, they acted also in such interest, not only political interest, but also economic interest, because they wanted to enrich themselves, including Yanukovych. He was basically linked to such oligarchs.
It's also very important to mention that you predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, and therefore you were not allowed to go into Russia and pursue your further studies.
Yes, when I was student actually in Ukraine at the time of the Soviet Union, I had to kind of write my final thesis, undergraduate thesis in university in Kiev in 1990, and I submitted my research proposal. I submitted my thesis proposal to my advisor, and he said that he would not could no longer be my advisor. He said that he kind of told me that I have to speak to administration of my university. And when I talked to the dean of my faculty, the dean of my faculty told me that I would be expelled from my university if I were to write my thesis, what I proposed to do. Because in my undergraduate thesis, I wrote that in my undergraduate thesis, I said I'm going to use my kind of a thesis based on the Western theories of Western economists and sociologists like Max Weber, Alfred Marshall, Keynes, and Friedrich Hayek. So this is like Western classical economists, and I did this. And Max Weber, who's a classical sociologist. So I wrote my thesis anyway, even so I had a set of being expelled from university. And in my thesis, undergraduate thesis, I wrote that Soviet system was not efficient compared to free market economy or market economy based on this series of Western economists and Max Weber. And they did not expel me after I wrote my thesis, which was actually in Ukrainian language, which was also very unique because education of at the time in universities was Russian language based. So I wrote this thesis, and instead of kind of expelling me from university because of politics changed, I was I was given basically C mark, a C grade for my undergraduate thesis for this reason, and this meant even so I have all other excellent grades, I could not go for this reason to study for graduate school to continue with graduate education. I wanted to be a professor, but it was not possible to do this in the entire Soviet Union because I needed to have a recommendation from my university, and obviously I could not get such a recommendation to apply to graduate school at the time. So this meant again that basically I was punished and prevented from going to graduate school because what I wrote in my undergraduate thesis. Which well, actually was supported later because Soviet system collapsed. I said that the Soviet system would collapse, and it's actually collapsed in 1991, and Soviet Union also collapsed. And only afterwards I was able to continue my education. I went to graduate school in Czech Republic at the Central European University, and later moved to the United States, where I got my master's degree and PhD.
Do you think, according what you have just said, that the fall of the Yanukovych government, was it legit, or was it somehow facilitated by a certain fraction, not just within, but potentially also beyond Ukraine, that thought that this will be convenient?
Yes, basically, Yanukovych was overthrown with involvement of Maidan opposition, elements of Maidan opposition, which included far right elements from the right sector and from Svoboda Party, which combine basically radical nationalism with some neo-Nazi elements and neo-Nazi organizations, openly neo-Nazis, and also they were doing this in alliance with oligarchic politicians and parties in Ukraine, which were pro-Western but basically linked to oligarchs who were who have control over media and so on. But this overthrow of Yanukovych was also done with de facto, at least de facto, support of Western governments. And I present all this evidence in my studies, in my book, in my peer-reviewed journal articles, and my conference papers and popular publications, popular media publications, and interviews. So all this evidence shows that there was involvement basically of far-right elements of Maidan opposition, oligarchic elements of Maidan opposition, but also de facto, at least de facto, support from Western governments for this undemocratic, violent, illegal, and unconstitutional overthrow of Ukrainian government in 2014, which led to such conflicts. And such evidence includes uh, eyewitness testimonies, witness testimonies. You have also admissions by members of Maidan sniper groups, some of which were from Georgia. They testified that they were from Georgia, and they basically were told by Maidan opposition leaders to massacre both Maidan activists and police. There are also kind of interviews from members of far right Svoboda Party in which they said that Western representative met with members on leaders of Maidan opposition leadership, including Svoboda Party, far right Svoboda Party, in around February of 2014, few weeks before the Maidan massacre, and they discussed actually how many uh, people need to be killed or would have to be killed on Maidan during Maidan protests and violence for the Western governments to stop recognizing Yanukovych as the leader of Ukraine. And so they said, they asked, Maidan opposition leaders asked this Western representative, is 5 people enough? And this Western representative said, no, 5 people not enough. They said like 10, 10 is not enough, 20, 20 is not enough. And they said they agree with this Western representative that 100 people would be enough for the West to kind of to stop recognizing Yanukovych government because he would be held responsible for this for their murder. And this is exactly what happened on the day of Maidan massacre. Maidan opposition declared number of Maidan activists who were killed as heavily handed. So they said there was a heavily handed of Maidan activists, which is exactly kind of matches what this target of 100 people to be killed. Even the number of Maidan activists who were killed was less than 100. They included people who were not killed on Maidan. Some of them were killed in other areas of Ukraine. Some of them just died from health reasons like heart attacks and so on. even so they were on Maidan, but they died from like uh, illnesses and so on, but they were included in this list of 100 or heavily 100, and this is led immediately to the Western governments to stop recognizing the Yanukovych government. And there is also a memoir by Joe Biden, in which he wrote that he called Yanukovych right after the Maidan massacre and told Yanukovych that he was responsible for this Maidan massacre, and he said that Yanukovych have not only to leave his position as president of Ukraine, but also he have to flee Ukraine. And this is exactly what happened. So basically, you have no investigation by Western governments and acceptance immediately and support for this violent overthrow of Ukrainian government. Even so, it was clear from the start that there was no evidence that Yanukovych or his government or even police members or snipers massacred Maidan activists. So this was kind of, I think, a very clear sign that there was Western support, at least de facto Western government support, including support from Joe Biden and his administration. And Biden at the time was vice president for the Obama administration. So there was such support for overthrow of Ukrainian government, and this is continues since then. There was no investigation, no admission by the Western governments of what actually happened during the Maidan massacre, and they basically tried to pretend that this was democratic, peaceful kind of overthrow and legal, constitutional overthrow of undemocratic government of Ukraine. Even so, this was just opposite, based on my research and based on evidence.
Why do you think that Western governments would have vested interest in making people kill people in Ukraine to gain in one way or another influence in Ukraine?
I think initially Western government supported this overthrow of Yanukovych government by saying that they supported democracy, they supported like Maidan opposition, which was they proclaimed this was democratic movement, and they said this was legal overthrow and so on. But in fact, they kind of based on my research and based on what happened afterwards, they supported this overthrow, as I mentioned, illegal, undemocratic, and violent by means of force like Maidan Massacre. They supported this overthrow of Yanukovych government because of geopolitical reasons. They did not care about Ukraine. They did not care about casualties, how many people would be killed. They do not care about actually democracy, rule of law, kind of human rights, legality, constitutionality of this overthrow, and afterwards what happened. They regarded Ukraine as a tool, again, as an important tool, as an important prize to contain Russia. This explains why Western governments supported this illegal and constitutional, basically mass murder, and people who came to power were implicated in this murder in Ukraine, but they were proclaimed and supported by the West. And this is kind of very important because Ukraine was regarded as a very important way to contain Russian influence during Maidan and after Maidan, and afterwards now during the war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine was used as a proxy by Western governments to also to weaken Russia, using basically Ukraine and Ukrainian lives. Even so, this war had devastating consequences to Ukraine, but it was supported by the West without any possibility of Russia being defeated. And but again, Western governments supported this war. Even so, you have such devastating consequences to Ukraine and Ukrainians. And right after Maidan massacre took place, and after a new government came to power in Ukraine, after Yanukovych was basically fled Ukraine because he was falsely accused of being responsible for Maidan massacre, and he was also subject of assassination attempts by members of Maidan opposition, including far-right opposition. So this you have creation of new government, which became basically a client state of the United States. It became dependent and supported by the West, but it was not kind of fully independent because there is evidence and a variety of evidence, including phone call between Nuland and U.S. ambassador in Ukraine before Maidan, before this Maidan massacre, and there's also other evidence, including phone calls between Biden and President of Ukraine Poroshenko, and other evidence, including Ukrainian media reports and even admission by Joe Biden that Western government officials, including specifically Joe Biden and other top U.S. government officials, were involved in selection and or removal of top government officials in Ukraine, including Prime Minister of Ukraine, like Yatsenyuk, and Groisman, and including Prosecutor General of Ukraine. And this was admitted by Joe Biden himself. So this is, I think, very clearly shows that Ukraine became client state after the Maidan, and it continued to remain a client state even right now, when basically Zelensky just today said that he kind of reversed his position, and after Donald Trump made a statement that he has to negotiate with Putin directly, after Putin offered such negotiations. So basically, Zelensky had to follow this statement by Donald Trump, because of total dependence of Ukraine on the United States. And even so, he tried to argue with Trump. This did not end well, and Trump showed basically that Ukraine is still a client state of the United States, and he has to follow his lead and his guides in terms of in terms of accepting what Donald Trump wants Ukraine to do. But there are obviously some, but Ukraine is not a colony of the United States, as Russia claims. There's still a autonomy of decisions of Ukrainian government since Maidan, and including Zelensky government right now. So this is situation which is, I think, it is important to understand that Ukraine basically is just tool, a proxy, or a client state of the West, and this is done for the reasons which are geopolitical reasons, to contain and to weaken Russia, and without again caring about negative consequences to Ukraine, and many lives of Ukrainians killed during Maidan or after Maidan, in civil war in Donbass, and also now in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is which is still ongoing and has very negative consequences to Ukraine.
How does it make you feel when you look what happened over the past 10 years to Ukraine?
I think this is very difficult to experience this, because as a researcher, I kind of I specialize in researching violence. I researched violence during World War II, which was much more devastating conflict in Ukraine. But now, when watching this, basically, when you watch people getting killed now on social media, all these videos, when I was watching Maidan Massacre, when people getting killed and their murder was televised, and so this is very difficult to watch this, because as Ukrainian, I'm also concerned about Ukraine and future of Ukraine, and for me this was just terrible to watch and experience, because I knew actually that this conflict could have been prevented and avoided, and the same could have happened with Maidan. So Maidan massacre was easily avoidable and prevented, and it was easy to prevent escalation and avoid escalation of the conflicts after Maidan by trying to resolve this Maidan massacre and punish and identify and prosecute those who were responsible for this mass murder. But this never happened. So I was basically watching all this conflict escalate from one conflict to another, with much more negative consequences to Ukraine each time. Even so, all the media coverage, all the politicians were saying opposite. They said that again, Ukraine was winning this conflict, that Ukrainians are supporting such conflicts and so on. Um, they want that they defeating Russia and so on. Even so, this was total propaganda and total disinformation, because it was very clear since Maidan massacre, that media and politicians and government officials, they did not care about actually evidence. They just wanted to do this promote narrative which was politically convenient and not based on any evidence, and they would ignore and or deny all the evidence which was available about Maidan massacre. The same happens with other conflicts, like war in Donbass was presented as a not civil war, but as a war between Russia and Ukraine. Even so, majority of scholars, including myself, who research this conflict, classifies this as a civil war with Russian military interventions. And now this war between Russia and Ukraine also became a proxy war between West and Russia in Ukraine, and this was also denied until recently, until Boris Johnson and a new Secretary of State of the U.S. Rubio, Mark Rubio, admitted that this is basically proxy war, and so now it kind of basically whatever what we were saying, what I was saying based on my research, now is supported by admissions by top politicians in the West. But I think this is kind of still already too late, and media still misrepresents all these conflicts started from Maidan, going back to war in Donbass, and now this Russia-Ukraine war. So this is nothing unusual, and because I study other conflicts as well, so I was watching this kind of conflicts in other countries. So this is quite kind of consistent with media coverage, which is not reliable and based on kind of often misrepresentation of what was going on. And this was especially clear during the Maidan massacre in Ukraine.
Before we really go and talk about how it could have been prevented and what are potential steps that the new administration, Russia and Ukraine, have to take in order to settle this devastating conflict, what I always find mind boggling is the following. No one is talking about the hundreds of thousands of mainly men, young men, in their very best in their lives, sent out into this war to just be killed. I have been traveling every year. I go in the summer. I spend my summer in Europe, and I see time and again very young mothers with childrens without a man. And every time I talk to these women and their children, it always becomes obvious that they are from Ukraine. So to me, that's just in terms of from a humanitarian aspect, it's just so crazy. And in addition, the fact that, as you laid out, though, the history is very complex, it's very diverse. It's not monolithic at all. It's very diverse. So we have to take this into account, and I think that's also one of the reasons why people are so misled. I mean, there's still people who argue seriously, say that the Russian invasion is simply a way in order to reestablish the Russian Empire. So, my question is, do you think Russia is the threat to Ukraine and the West as it is portrayed by and large?
I think there was a real possibility of a war between Russia and Ukraine and Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I stated this publicly in my media interviews, in social media comments and posts which before Russian invasion. And at the time, this was not kind of a popular view. Majority of people, including politicians, including Zelensky, they denied that there would be any Russian invasion. They believe that this was just Russian kind of intimidation tactics, that they assembled military forces next to Ukraine, next to Ukraine or near Ukraine, and so this was basically kind of dismissed even by most scholars, experts. This was regarded as not likely to happen. Even so, I said this is a very real possibility. This is kind of actual danger for Ukraine, but again, this went against the dominant view. And after Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, this was also very clear that this is, again, invasion which is not a legal invasion. This was violation of international law. But I think afterwards you have also kind of propaganda, disinformation of this Russian invasion and war in Ukraine as kind of by the West, by the Western media, politicians, and also by Ukrainian and government politicians, but also by Russian government and media and politicians as well. So basically, they presented very different opposite narratives, and Russia claims that they wanted this was not a war, this was special military operation, and they wanted to prevent genocide of ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine, which is not supported by any evidence. There was not such genocide. Again, according to common definition, academic definitions of genocide in Ukraine, and also this was clear case of war, and it was not legal under international law. But Western government narratives and Ukrainian government narratives, and which was basically taken at face value by media, mainstream media in the West and Ukraine, was that Russia wanted to occupy entire Ukraine. That they wanted to capture Kiev and all other major cities in Ukraine. They wanted to restore Russian Empire because they wanted to make Ukraine part of Russia, not only kind of Donbass, but other regions of Ukraine, all other regions of Ukraine, they also said that Russia wanted to use Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine, as a first step to launch a war against Baltic states and against Poland and against other countries like Romania and potentially Western Europe, including Germany and France and so on. But this was not based on evidence. This is also, and they also claim that Russia was conducting genocide of Ukrainians, and this is again, all these claims were not supported by evidence, and they were contradicted by the evidence. And I examined these claims, these narratives, and evidence actually in my forthcoming book about the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins. And this book would be published also by major Western academic press this summer. And in this book, I look into all these arguments, all these reasons for the war, which are presented by the media and politicians, and I basically say that this is also kind of not supported by evidence, by the data, and even so, you have such claims often taken at face value, not only by the media, but also by many people who are not familiar with this conflict, not able to distinguish between propaganda and disinformation and actual evidence-based research and evidence-based conclusions. So this is, I think, very clear that this deliberate misrepresentation of this war by Western governments and media, claiming that this is was motivated by kind of Russia trying to eliminate Ukrainians as a nation, as a people, and also wanted to make Ukraine as part of Russian Empire. Based on evidence which I presented in my book, I can say that Russia wanted to include Donbass, eastern part of, which is part of eastern Ukraine, which was led by separatists since 2014, and but not recognized by any other country, so even Russia, until Russian invasion of Ukraine, or until a few days before Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Russia wanted basically to support the separatists in Donbass, uh, as they did in Crimea, but Russian invasion initially did not want to even include Donbass as a part of Russia. Russia and Ukraine negotiated a peace deal in Istanbul in 2022 in March and April, and according to this peace deal framework, which was accepted by Ukrainian government representatives and by Russia, and was very close to being finalized, but was blocked later by the West, by Boris Johnson and um, by Biden administration. So basically, this peace deal included Russian withdrawal of Russian forces from all the regions of Ukraine, with the exception of Crimea, whose status need to be discussed by Ukraine and Russia in the future, like in 20 or some years later, and also Donbass. Status of Donbass was to be decided by negotiations between Zelensky and Putin. And Russia would have to withdraw basically their forces from all other regions of Ukraine, including areas near Kiev and also areas of Zaporizhia and Kherson region in southern Ukraine, which was occupied by Russia at the start of this war. And Russia withdrew their forces from Kiev region, Kiev area, and all other regions in near Kiev. After this peace deal framework was accepted by the Ukrainian government, and so this was kind of a result. This will show basically that Russia did not want to occupy Ukraine, even regions in the parts of Ukraine which were occupied by Russia. Russia did not want to annex them, not to make under full Russian control or permanent permanent Russian control. And there was also no evidence of any local administration created by Russia after during occupation of these regions, with the exception of Donbass. So in Donbass, there was a creation of separatist government and administration at the locations which were controlled by Russia or kind of captured by Russia and separatist forces. But in all other regions of Ukraine, there was no even local administration created by Russia, by Russian occupation forces, and this meant that they did not intend to kind of to govern these areas. They wanted to withdraw these forces. So basically, the goal of Russian invasion, most important goal of Russian invasion, was to kind of pressure Ukraine to accept kind of a peace deal under Russian terms, which meant neutrality of Ukraine, no NATO membership of Ukraine, and also kind of they say kind of demilitarization of Ukraine, and also Russia, I think, might have wanted to have a regime change in Ukraine, which would be part of this is a kind of agreement or would be a consequence of such agreement to make Ukraine kind of more neutral, not in terms of pro-Western orientation, but more neutral or pro-Russian in terms of its orientation, as for instance, similarly to neutral country like Georgia or similarly to pro-Russian country like Belarus.
So, what you're basically saying is that Russia has as much reasons, if we follow the Russian logic, to justify the invasion as Ukraine has to defend itself in one way or another, because both feel a imminent threat to their national security. On one hand, we have the Russians who feel if Ukraine will join NATO, that this is a existential threat for Russia. Now, as one of the major four powers, and correct me, Professor, to me they are USA, China, India, and Russia. Those are the four superpowers in this world. In other words, and help me if you don't agree. It almost looks like as the US missile crisis when Cuba had basically these missiles just about 100 kilometers away from the US border. And obviously, the US could never ever accept that there is a country who is affiliated with the former Soviet Union has missiles so close to his country. Do you think this example illustrates a little bit where the Russians are coming from in order to understand their rationale in invading Ukraine? Because Russia, as I understand you correctly, doesn't really have any ambition to go back to the former Soviet Union and take further territories, because it showed that they can't even take control of Ukraine within 3 years.
I think this is more complex, which I also examine in my book and in my academic publications and conference papers. So, based on second argument or second consideration, Russia initially did not want to annex these regions, with exception of kind of supporting independence of Donetsk and Lugansk separatist controlled republics and recognizing their independence before Russia invaded Ukraine. But kind of as a borders which included also part of these regions of Ukraine which were controlled by Ukrainian government. But after the failure of Minsk agreements, after the Western countries blocked Western agreement, sorry, Minsk, not Minsk, but Istanbul peace deal agreements in spring of 2022, Putin policy changed, and Putin decided and declared that Russia would annex Donbass uh, kind of in territory, including regions part of these regions controlled by Ukrainian government, and also would annex Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, make it part of Russia, and Russia did this in October 2022, and this was justified by Russia. That they are historically Russian regions. They are kind of a part of so-called Novorossiya, New Russia region, and this is based on kind of on argument or kind of perception by Russian government, by Putin, that this is kind of historic. Or historical claims to these regions based on kind of a Russian imperialist view or kind of but kind of a view of these regions as kind of part of Russia, and the same applies to some other regions of Ukraine, which can potentially be a part of Russia. Russia can make similar claims, like for instance about Kharkiv region or Odessa region, as part of historical region of Russia. Even so, kind of currently there is no evidence that Russia plans to annex these regions, but if the war continue, there is such possibility. So this such a kind of factor was important in terms of Russian kind of views of Ukraine as historically a region part of Russia, as a kind of imperialist view of Ukraine. But this was secondary factor. So this was not most important factor for the reasons which I mentioned. It only came into play after the failure of peace deal, which would have basically Russia would have abundant control over kind of regions of Ukraine which were occupied by Russia, and again and make Donbass or trying to recognize Donbass and Crimea as at the time as kind of as is a part of Russia, kind of, or in case of Donbass as independent kind of from Ukraine, independent state from Ukraine. But most important factor was kind of going back to this conflicts, Maidan massacre, which escalated into the Russian kind of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and escalated into war between Russia and Ukraine. So this is kind of was not an unprovoked war, as Western governments and media claim, but there was also no kind of evidence and there was a real evidence and kind of real danger or kind of security threat from NATO enlargement of Ukraine, and the fact that Ukraine became client state of the West after, or United States in particular, after the Maidan overthrow of Ukrainian government. So this is kind of important factor, NATO membership or NATO admission, accession of Ukraine, which was a potential for Ukraine to become NATO member, goal of Ukraine becoming NATO member, and de facto case that you can stop to be a neutral country after Maidan and became a client state of the West, in which Western governments basically had control over Ukrainian politics and policy to a large extent, including government official nominations and so on. And decisions like, including kind of decisions like starting war in Donbass, kind of was also, you have involvement of the Western governments, in particular United States officials, according to the evidence which was presented. But these security threats to Russia, which were real, were inflated by the Russian government to justify this invasion, because in contrast to Cuban Missile Crisis, or in kind of in contrast to claims by Russian government, there was no imminent danger of Ukraine becoming member of NATO, or there was no imminent danger of any Ukrainian attack on Donbass, which was controlled by separatist forces, which were supported by Russia. So so such membership of Ukraine in NATO was not likely in the foreseeable future, and this was based on my research, and now basically supported by a lot of evidence and even admissions by NATO officials, by Western government officials, and by Zelensky himself, who said basically all of them said that there was no possibility of Ukraine becoming member of NATO, that they basically lied about Ukraine. That Ukraine would join NATO and, very soon. So there was no such possibility, real possibility of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. There was also no evidence of a deployment of any NATO missiles or any such weapons which can threaten Russia militarily from Ukraine as offensive weapons as was placed in Cuba during the Caribbean Missile Crisis. So this is kind of important to understand. So this was important factor, much more important than Russian imperialism in starting a Russian invasion. But Russia invaded this security threat from Ukraine in terms of NATO membership, and not and Ukraine becoming client state of the West, and kind of and being used as a proxy or kind of or tool against Russia. Russia inflated this danger in order to justify their invasion. So this means a Russian invasion was not justified legally, and because Russia justifies this as a kind of a need to invade Ukraine because of such security threat, imminent security threat, but there was no such imminent danger. So this is very important kind of to understand this conflict. So each side also kind of misrepresent this conflict and its origins, and so it's important to look into evidence of actually what happened and and so I can say that based on this information, not only Western governments and media and Ukrainian government in the media misrepresented this conflict, but also Russian government and media also misrepresented this conflict and this war and its origins and its nature. So each side kind of makes claims which are often based not on kind of evidence, but based on politically convenient considerations and narratives or based on propaganda and disinformation.
What would have changed if Russia would have joined NATO as Boris Yeltsin suggested in the 1990s?
I think Russia wanted to apply to join NATO, and this was not only the kind of view of Boris Yeltsin after collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but also Putin also wanted to join NATO, and he even asked Bill Clinton, who was at the time U.S. president, that kind of he said that to Bill Clinton that Russia wanted to join NATO, and basically Bill Clinton and other Russian and other Western government officials basically rejected this idea out of hand. This was not possible. As I said, there was no such possibility of Russia joining NATO, and I think a similar situation was with Ukraine, as I mentioned, kind of in my paper and my articles which I published about politics of enlargement of NATO and European Union countries. But in contrast to Russia, Ukraine was offered such possibility, kind of a prospect for joining NATO during Bucharest summit in 2008. Even so, again, there was no real possibility of doing this. This was kind of written on a paper, so this became a real issue, kind of which Russia used to kind of justify this invasion of Ukraine. But this was a real threat. This was a real security threat for doing this. But in the West, Russia kind of is perceived as a competitor, as kind of as a country which challenges Western dominance, so kind of or U.S.-led world order. And for this reason, again, Ukraine was used basically to contain Russia and during the war it was used to weaken Russia, but kind of. But again, this does not justify a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was illegal under international law, and Russia inflated claims about kind of dangers and security set from Ukraine based on these considerations. But I think this is very clear that Western governments do not want to treat Russia as equal country or kind of or accept this into Western club of NATO, military alliance of NATO, because the purpose of NATO basically was to contain Russia, and it was organized by the West in, I think, in 1949, specifically to contain Soviet Union, and Russia was regarded as a successor to the Soviet Union, and NATO was remaining in place, and not only remaining in place, it started to include many countries which used to be part of the Soviet-led Warsaw Bloc countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, or but also included like Baltic states, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was regarded in this case as just another member of European Union, of NATO, another part of the Soviet Union, which could be part of NATO, and used for specifically also to contain Russia, to weaken Russian influence, and to kind of to be used against Russia. And in this case, I think it was very clear that there was no real possibility for Russia to join in NATO. Even so, kind of Western politicians were talking about all this new world order and kind of an equality of countries and so on. But in actual politics, this is much more complex and based on interests and not kind of such statements which are often kind of done just for public relations reasons and not for actually reflection of actual views of politicians who make such decisions about enlargement of military alliance, enlargement of NATO, and other issues.
Where has international diplomacy failed the past 30 years?
I think there are a lot of failures of diplomacy, and specifically, I think a major failure of diplomacy was after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And this collapse in the West was presented basically as a defeat of the Soviet Union by the West. So this was major misunderstanding actually what happened, because collapse of the Soviet Union was basically a result of policies, internal policies of the Soviet Union under leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who initiated reforms in perestroika and glasnost policies. So this led to collapse of the Soviet Union specifically because of kind of also countries which or republics which from Soviet Union, in particular Baltic states, and also like republics like Georgia, Moldova, and later Ukraine. They decided that they wanted to become independent countries after the attempt of specifically after attempt of a coup. Which was led in August of 2000, in August 1991, by hardline opposition within Soviet leadership to Mikhail Gorbachev. So this is a kind of collapse of the Soviet Union presented opportunity basically to have a new kind of policy, kind of abandon or eliminate the NATO alliance and to end this conflict, which was defining conflict of Cold War between Soviet Union and the Western-led NATO. But this was not used. Actually, they decided instead to enlarge NATO. So enlargement of NATO became a major factor which led ultimately to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and also to conflict between Russia and the West. And this is, I think, was major failure, kind of in this case, after the collapse of Soviet Union, and also collapse of relations between Russia and the West, and also kind of a start of conflict between Ukraine and and Ukraine and the and Russia. But I think another major failure of diplomacy was failure to prevent this war between Russia and Ukraine, because it was possible to prevent this war. There was such possibility to have a peaceful resolution of this conflict, for instance, by recognizing autonomy or independence of Donbass, led Donbass separatist regions in eastern Ukraine, and just de facto or de jure, kind of, or specifically de facto, it was possible to do this within still as a part of Ukraine, and also for Ukraine and to the West admit that Ukraine would not become a member of NATO. So it was easy to do this. There was no need to to abandon Ukrainian membership in NATO, because there was no such real possibility in the first place. So it was easy for the West and for Ukraine, basically Ukrainian government, to state that Ukraine would not join NATO. It would become a neutral country, like for instance Austria or Switzerland and so on, and this would have prevented the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the war between Russia and Ukraine. So this is a major failure of diplomacy, and also kind of which has very negative consequences. Another failure of diplomacy was actually possibility of peaceful end and peaceful resolution of the war between Russia and Ukraine after the Russian invasion already started. So I mentioned already Istanbul peace deal framework, which was very close to being finalized between Russia and Ukraine, which could have ended this war in the spring of 2022, just a few months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But instead, Western governments, in particular Boris Johnson and Biden administration, they decided to use this war, to use this Russian invasion as to fight a proxy war with Russia using Ukraine, and they blocked this agreement, this peace deal, which was very close to being finalized. And this had, again, this not only presented a major failure of diplomacy, because it could have been a much better outcome for Ukraine and the West, but this also represented kind of very negative consequences to Ukraine and the West, because this war against Russia could not have been won. Even after Western countries started to support Ukraine and use Ukraine as a proxy, still Russia maintained its advantage. So it was very clear from the start, even from the start of invasion by Russia, or even before Russian invasion, that Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia, or to kind of repel Russian invasion, even with Western country support. So in any case, the war in Ukraine would would end with defeat of Ukraine. The only question was how much defeat would be. Is it going to be partial, and how much territory Russia would control, and what kind of peace conditions would be. But there was no real possibility of defeating Russia, which is a major nuclear power and also has much bigger weapons and military potential and manpower potential compared to Ukraine, because there was no real possibility of NATO becoming involved in this war directly, because in such case conflict could be escalated into nuclear war between NATO and Russia, which is again was not of interest to Western countries. But now defeat of Ukraine in this war, and which is now I think clear to many people. The only question is how big it will be, is also would mean also defeat for the West, because Western countries use Ukraine as a proxy in the proxy war. So now this defeat would also kind of mean defeat of Western countries, which would have negative consequences to the West in terms of their influence. And this defeat of Ukraine in this proxy war can also lead to a new world order, because this might lead to end of U.S. domination, U.S.-led world order, and now this possibility of multipolar world order in which you have other countries, including China and Russia, might have a much bigger influence compared to the start of this war. So I think this is kind of real consequences of this conflict, which would be very important not only to Ukraine and Russia, but also to many other countries. Which were not directly involved in this war, but countries which supported this war as a proxy war, but also other countries in the world, including like Africa and South Asian countries and countries in Latin America, because of these changes in world order as a result of this war.
Why did Ukraine not say to Russia, we won't join NATO in order to avoid hundred thousands of deaths?
I think it was easy to do, and this is, I think, Zelensky kind of an decision, but also decision by Western countries, because, as I mentioned, Zelensky kind of is the leader of country, leader of Ukraine, kind of, but Ukraine is a client state of the United States, basically a client state of the West. So decisions by Zelensky to continue this war and kind of trying to defeat Russia and to reclaim all the territories which were lost to Russia since 2014, including Crimea and Donbass, was totally kind of foolish. This is like major folly. This was totally decision which was not kind of based on any reality. This was wishful thinking, but it was basically used to justify continuation of this war and trying to continue this war for a very long time. And this decision by Zelensky was not just his own decision; it was supported and influenced by the West, by specifically by Western countries and Western governments who decided to support and use Zelensky government again as a tool to as a client state, basically to weaken Russia in this proxy war. So in this case, this is like failure by Zelensky and by the Western countries, because if they said instead that they would agree that Ukraine would not join NATO and become a neutral country, this could have ended this or prevented this war and ended this war after it was already started by Russia. So it was easy to prevent and avoid this war. But I think this calculus became opposite, because it became beneficial for Zelensky to continue this war. He was rewarded as a politician, kind of who came from entertainment industry, like he was a comedian basically on Ukrainian television. So he was rewarded by the West with all this kind of glowing media coverage. He was presented as a new Churchill, kind of a hero, and as a kind of and given glowing media coverage, unprecedented kind of in modern world. Kind of, he was also given all these rewards, like all the kind of recognition. He was given standing ovations by the parliaments, by different governments, by different politicians who visited them, who visited him, and so on. So he was given basically a lot of money, also Western government support to finance Ukrainian government expenditures and continue this war. He was given weapons to do this. So basically, he was rewarded for for fighting this war for kind of not preventing this war, instead of seeking peaceful resolution of this conflict. And even peaceful resolution, as I mentioned, which was easier to achieve, or prevention of this conflict just by saying no, NATO membership of Ukraine was totally rejected by Zelensky and by the West, because they claim that Ukraine can has a right to become a member of NATO. Even so, they did this publicly. Even so, they knew privately, and they admitted privately. And now this is recognized and was admitted by Zelensky himself and by other Western government officials, including from Biden administration, that they knew privately, and told Zelensky that Ukraine would never that Ukraine would not join NATO in foreseeable future. So this is, I think, basically this is just I think this is quite I think not only foolish decision, because I think this was also deliberate, specific decision, specifically to create this incentive for Ukraine to believe, and Ukrainians should believe that they actually would be able to become part of NATO and would become part of NATO alliance and would be protected by the West in the future if they would be able to contain Russia or defeat Russia. But this was totally fake. This was a misleading kind of incentive for Ukraine. Ukraine would never again be offered this, and and this is what I've predicted in my research and I mentioned in my research, but again, all the media coverage was totally opposite. They said that Ukraine would join NATO. As I mentioned, politicians were talking about Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Even so, it was easy to avoid all of this and saying that Ukraine would not just join NATO and would become a neutral country, but this opportunity was not used. Even so, Zelensky basically admitted this and de facto accepted this in an agreement which was very close to being finalized in Istanbul in spring of 2022.
What has Zelensky have to do when it comes to the fallen soldiers and the wives and families there are left behind?
I think there is a very big issue in Ukraine because, according to my estimates, the number of Ukrainian forces members who are killed in this war now would be at least 150,000 um, members and forces killed in action during this war, and about 600,000 wounded, based on typical ratio of wounded to killed. So this is, I think, very kind of very large casualties, which would be the biggest number of casualties in Europe, in Europe since World War II, and would be so have a tremendous effect on Ukraine and Ukrainian society for a long period of time, because this war, as I mentioned, could have been prevented, avoided. All these casualties, all these people could have been alive and not been killed in this war, which could not be won by Ukraine. And this was clear from the start, again, based on research which I conducted. But again, this was not recognized. So Zelensky, instead, he took all Ukrainian media under his own control after the Russian invasion. So he promoted this view on the media, kind of on Ukrainian television channels, which are basically became government-led channels, just kind of spreading propaganda by Zelensky. So there are no debates, no questions asked in Ukrainian media about Zelensky and his policies, and number of casualties is regarded as a state secret. And Zelensky admitted he only said that the number of Ukrainian foreign forces members killed would be much smaller. He said like 40,000 killed, and recently I think he said 70,000 killed, and so on. But actually, number of casualties in Ukraine, number who forces who are killed, is much larger, because this is can be confirmed by a number of individual forces members who are killed and identified in Ukrainian media. There is a website which lists all these members by name, by place of their where they came from, and so on. And it's possible to say that now, kind of based on such evidence, that now, and similar to my research, as I mentioned, number of Ukrainian forces members killed um, would be about 150,000, and this is, I think, very large number, but this is hidden from Ukrainians, so people in Ukraine do not know about the extent of these casualties. And one way this is done basically to avoid giving information even to many people who kind of families of many soldiers and other members of Ukrainian forces who are killed is to list people who are kind of who are very likely killed as missing in action. So you have very large number of Ukrainian forces members who are listed as missing in action, and they are not recognized as killed. Even so, I think they almost definitely they were killed because a number of Ukrainian POWs, prisoners of war, is already kind of known and is just about 5,000 members of Ukrainian forces are prisoners of war in Russia, identified also by name, and there are prisoners exchanges between Russia and Ukraine of prisoners since the start of Russian invasion, but number of missing in action actually most of them are members of Ukrainian forces would be something like close to 70,000. So this is a very large number, and so this means that again, many people actually do not even know that their members, their relatives are killed, and many Ukrainians do not know the extent, very heavy extent of casualties of Ukrainian forces members um, who are listed as killed or missing in action because media does not report this. There is no admission by Zelensky and his government officials. This is a state secret, basically, and they misrepresent the number of casualties as very small, and they claim instead that the number of Russian forces members killed is like 10 times higher, that Ukraine is winning this war by defeating Russia, which is totally, I think, not supported by evidence, because according to my research and estimates of casualties, actually number of Russian um, forces members who are identified by name by BBC, Russian service by BBC, and other sources would be now about 100,000, and plus about 20 or 25,000 members of Ukrainian separatist forces in Donbass who now are fighting along with Russia, also killed in according to BBC estimate. So this is, I think, kind of kind of also evidence that there is no kind of a possibility for Ukraine to defeat Russia, but Ukrainian kind of media and Ukrainian politicians, and specifically Zelensky, misrepresent this specifically, and not even talk about casualties of Ukrainian forces in order to kind of continue this war, because otherwise people would not be willing to fight, and there are already kind of number of volunteers to join the Ukrainian forces became close to zero, a very small number. Nobody wants to join voluntarily such and go to war with Russia. So you have a lot of videos and other evidence of forced mobilization when people are captured, men are captured on the streets by press gangs, by military officers, by mobilization officers. They just snatched and put in buses, and with very limited training, they are sent to fight against Russian forces, and many of them are killed and died or are wounded or missing in action. And also, you have a very large number of desertions from Ukrainian forces, which is more than 100,000 and growing number. So this is, I think, clear evidence that kind of this deliberate strategy by Zelensky to avoid talking about this issue and misrepresent casualties of Ukrainian forces, kind of members, and list them kind of as missing in action, or not to report this to Ukrainians, and not to tell these Ukrainians and mislead them that the actually number of casualties is much higher in Russia among Russian forces, even so this is not the case based on all evidence which I examined.
What do you make of the aggressive rhetoric of Emmanuel Macron and others European leaders?
I think one of the problems of, or one of the revelations of this war was the European Union, and European Union member leaders, like including France, French leader Emmanuel Macron, and they kind of basically they made the European Union kind of more belligerent now and more kind of pro-war than even the United States now under Donald Trump leadership. And this is, I think, very kind of important, because the European Union was regarded as an economic organization, and France was kind of had a reputation and kind of and distinction as being independent country, kind of more from the West, kind of from the United States. led the order under President de Gaulle and other even recent French presidents. So France did not support U.S. invasion of the war in Iraq. So it was also kind of even it kind of it tried to promote its own independent policy, and France was very instrumental in negotiating peace between Russia and Georgia during the war in Georgia after Saakashvili started a military operation to try to take back a separatist region of southern Ossetia and attack Russian military peacekeeping forces there, and Russia kind of invaded Georgia in response to this. So then President of France Sarkozy was involved in negotiating peace deal which ended this war between Russia and Georgia because Russia could have captured Tbilisi, but Russia withdrew its forces, but annexed region basically recognized as independent regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which were separatist regions controlled by separatists, which were supported by Russia, the presence of Russian military forces before the Russian invasion and before the war between Russia and Georgia. So in this case, there was possibility that Macron and other leaders of other European Union countries, including European Union, as an organization, could have helped to prevent and avoid this war in Ukraine. And I mentioned this in my media interviews. I think one way to do this was possible was to give Ukraine possibility or potential to become a European Union member. So if Ukraine would recognize that it become a neutral country, would recognize autonomy or Minsk agreements to Donbas separatist regions, and would abandon NATO membership, would say that you would not join NATO. In exchange, Ukraine could have been offered by European Union countries or leaders on the European Union itself possibility of joining European Union as incentive to resolve this conflict. But at the time before the Russian invasion, European Union, including leaders of countries like France, did not recognize Ukraine as an even potential member of European Union. And they did not support kind of peaceful resolution of this conflict. They basically supported the same policy which was led by Biden administration to kind of to just to kind of reject all demands of Russia and to support Ukrainian government led by Zelensky in confrontation with Russia, in conflict with Russia. So there was a kind of policy which became also very clear after the Russian invasion. France and other European Union member countries in the European Union, they became kind of more militarized. They became to support kind of more waging war in Ukraine, proxy war in Ukraine. They supported weapons. They gave weapons, military support, financial support, political support, kind of humanitarian support to the Ukrainian government, and they also started to oppose a peaceful resolution of this war after election of Donald Trump. And even in the last few days, the leaders of France, Macron specifically, the new leader of Germany, a new chancellor of Germany, and also new British Prime Minister and Prime Minister of Poland visited Ukraine, and they issued ultimatum basically to Russia to kind of accept the ceasefire proposal, which was offered by U.S. President Donald Trump, and otherwise, they said that they would impose sanctions against Russia. So basically, this kind of format of this ultimatum was not about peace, because this was more basically this was a way to kind of stop any possibility of peace deal, because kind of such form of ultimatum would not be kind of accepted by Russia, and this is what happened. Russia rejected this kind of ultimatum, which was kind of presented as supporting kind of um, ceasefire agreement. Even so, before this, Western governments opposed such a ceasefire agreement, and now they say they support this. But again, given this in form which would not be acceptable to end this war, so I think this is, just continuation of this policy in which Macron and other Western governments, they want to continue this war because for them they invested a lot of money, they invested prestige of their countries. So for them, defeat of Ukraine would basically defeat their own defeat. And this is why they want to continue this as long as possible. Kind of even so, there is no real possibility of changing outcome of this war. They, I think, view this as their own kind of personal investment because their political prestige. They are also possibility to stay in power also depends to a large extent on, as the same happens with Zelensky, this depends to a large extent on this continuation of this war, because otherwise they would have to admit defeat with all the negative consequences and all the changes in the world order, which I mentioned, which is, I think, could have been avoided and prevented, but this was not a policy which was chosen by Macron and other leaders of European Union.
What is the difference between Western propaganda and Russian propaganda, if there is any at all?
Yes, I examined this in my book. I examined all the narratives. I examined Russian propaganda, Ukrainian propaganda, and Western propaganda. This is like all. This is like, I think, which is important to understand that this is not the first war in which all different countries, different governments promote their own perspective, kind of, and their own propaganda kind of narrative about conflicts. This is very common. So this is it would be very strange if there was no propaganda by Russia or propaganda by, there was no propaganda by West or Ukraine. Even so, each of these countries' propaganda they say that they are the ones who tell the truth and they accuse other kind of like Western and Ukrainian governments accuse only Russia of doing propaganda, and Russia accuses West and Ukrainian government of doing propaganda. But actually, in case all of them, basically, according to my research and evidence, are doing propaganda to various extent. And so, in this case, for instance, as I mentioned already, Russia falsely claimed that its invasion of Ukraine was illegal, even though it's illegal under international law. They also falsely claimed that there was genocide of ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine, which is not supported by evidence. They also said that again, they said that Ukraine was a colony of the United States, which is not the case. Kind of Ukraine is not colony; it's a client state. They also said that Ukraine is Nazi state, which is not the case. Ukraine is not Nazi state. There is no Nazi government of Ukraine, but there is very strong and powerful, again, kind of far-right and including neo-Nazi movement and politicians neo-Nazi movement and neo-Nazi organizations which have now control over very large military formations in Ukraine, specifically by Azov movement and Azov brigades, and now kind of even larger formations. So in this case, but the Western governments deny, and in Ukrainian governments they deny that there were any kind of influence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So this is also propaganda. Kind of, they also falsely claim that there was a genocide of ethnic Ukrainians, that Russia wanted to invade and occupy entire Ukraine, make it part of the new Russian Empire, which I mentioned. They claim also that Russia wanted to occupy and invade other countries. There is no such evidence right now, and so this is, I think, propaganda by each side. This is very common, and I can say also media, which is supposed to be independent media in the West, because in media in Russia and Ukraine are controlled by the governments basically. So they are not independent, they are not free to extent which would be in the case in the West. So basically, Ukrainian and Russian media, they report and just present this conflict from a perspective of their respective government. This is not a debate. There are no alternative opinions given, and in the media, with some exceptions of um, kind of, but this is very limited exceptions. But in the West, media is regarded as free media, but actually, according to my research about media coverage, Western media also to a large extent follows their own governments, their own politicians in coverage of foreign conflicts. This is called indexing theory, which basically says that the media coverage is driven not by facts on the ground, not by the evidence, but by perspectives of this reflection of perspectives of political elite in the government or major opposition parties. And because there is no major opposition or government officials in the West, with the exception now of Donald Trump and his administration, which had a kind of opposite view or kind of or critical perspective on this conflict, or kind of they media basically represented all this conflict as a kind of based on propaganda and disinformation. Now, only now, Trump admitted basically and stated, and members of his administration stated that this is a proxy war, that Ukraine cannot join NATO, that Ukraine is not able to win the war. So this is now became admitted by Trump administration, but again, even Trump in his statements also give a lot of false information. For instance, he claims that there are millions of people killed in Ukraine, which is not the case. He says that many Ukrainian cities are destroyed, which is not the case, like with exception of Mariupol or cities in Donbass, which are again not much smaller compared even to Mariupol. This is not the case. Again, many cities like in Kiev not um, suffer a lot of destruction in this war. A number of people killed, civilians killed in Ukraine, according to estimates of according to data from United Nations, is about 13,000, including almost 6,000 in Russian control part of Donbass and other regions of Ukraine and separatist controlled Donbass. So in this case, there were also few thousand other casualties, which likely happened in Mariupol and other areas. So in this case, number of civilians killed are also kind of is not compatible with genocide, either by Russian or Ukrainian forces. So I think it's important to distinguish and identify propaganda and disinformation by each side, by Russian, by Western, and by Ukrainian side of this conflict, because this is what my research tells me. This is again, you have all these sides involved in propaganda, but to a different extent and different issues. But this is very common in any conflict to have such propaganda. So this is nothing unusual, but a lot of people just do not assume this, or they deny this, that even there such propaganda exists from another side of conflict, because this is kind of often is ignored or just rejected as out of hand. Even so, all the evidence shows that each side promotes their own propaganda narratives and uh, again, but not just entirely. You have kind of each side often embellishes information or kind of and so on, but it's necessary to kind of based on analysis, based on evidence, and not based on propaganda. Because as I mentioned in my book, I started my book saying that truth is the first casualty of the war, which is very common, and this is the same happened in this war between Russia and Ukraine. Truth became first casualty of this war.
What is the end game? What is your prediction to end this war, and how will it ultimately end, if at all?
I think it was clear from the start of this war that Ukraine would suffer defeat, because Russia has much bigger forces. It has much size of military forces much bigger, and Russia has also potential to mobilize much larger number of forces members by people in its military. And Russia is also a nuclear power, so it will not be possible for Ukraine to defeat Russia, because Russia, even if Ukraine were being able with Western support to kind of try to go into Crimea, then Russia would use military, not only the military forces, not mobilize military forces, but also would could use nuclear weapons in such case. So there was no possibility for Ukraine to kind of defeat Russia in this conflict, and this was very clear from the start. So I can say the only issue is what extent of defeat would be for Ukraine, and what kind of consequences of this defeat would be for Ukraine. So currently, based on this war, which became war of attrition, Ukraine is losing this war, but losing slowly, because Russia has advantage, as I mentioned, and Russia gains some territory. But it's not only territory, because Russia has advantage also in terms of military casualties, not a big one as some claims, but significant, specifically relative advantage. So Russia would be able to defeat Ukraine if the war would be continued for a longer period of time. And the only question is if this defeat would be partial, as we have right now, with gradual kind of Russia with Russia being able to take more Ukrainian territory in eastern and southern Ukraine, or if there would be a collapse of Ukrainian forces, if they would reach such a point, specifically after Western governments, specifically United States government, would stop military supplies of new weapons, there is a real possibility that Ukraine would not be able to continue this war and resist Russian forces, and there will be collapse of military front, and Russia would be able to occupy much bigger territory of Ukraine, and Ukraine would suffer basically capitulation. But I think right now we can say that that in any case, defeat of Ukraine is basically almost 100% certain. The only question is how much it will be, and this would also mean defeat of the West, which I mentioned, because we have a proxy war. So again, the best way to avoid this defeat or minimize, not avoid this defeat because it's already too late, but to minimize extent of this defeat, minimize negative impact on Ukraine and the West, is to have a peaceful agreement, peace deal, which could have prevented this war, in the first place. But it was possible now to have peace deal to end this war and minimize negative consequences to Ukraine and minimize also defeat of Ukraine and defeat and potential catastrophic defeat for Ukraine, which can happen. And the same applies to the West, because the longer war continues, Russia would have more advantage, and there is a much stronger possibility of catastrophic defeat of Ukraine. Even a partial defeat would mean that Russia would advance more, and any terms for peace deal for Ukraine would be much more difficult and much more negative compared to what was possible before, specifically in terms of a peace agreement, which was very close to being finalized in Istanbul in 2022, in April and March 2022. So in this case, I think it's clear that outcome of this war is is already certain, and contrary to propaganda about you can win this war, which was very prevalent from the start of this conflict. I always said that this is a likely defeat of Ukraine is most likely outcome of this war. The only question is how significant it will be, and I think this defeat could have been avoided and but prevented by having peaceful resolution of this conflict before Russian invasion, and after Russian invasion, the only way is to minimize this defeat, kind of and accept this defeat, and recognize that the longer war continues, the more negative outcome it would become for Ukraine and the West. And a peace deal would be a real possibility of ending this war and minimizing such defeat. But again, defeat cannot be avoided. And I think there is real possibility of such peaceful resolution under Trump administration, because he changed his policy of the United States, and there are negotiations taking place. But I think now. It became also much more difficult to Ukraine again and to the West to kind of accept such a peace deal because of personal interest, because of vested interest of politicians like Zelensky and Western politicians in the European Union, specifically because they supported this war. They kind of their future, political future, depends on continuing this war. Specifically, Zelensky, his power depends on on this war, and if he would lose power, he would lose. If he would, if the war would end, he would likely lose his power, and might have been and could have been also in this possibilities that he could be persecuted or even would be exiled from Ukraine, or even more significant negative casualties to Zelensky. So in this case, there are also people in the West and in the Ukrainian government who do not want to peaceful deal, because it would have negative consequences to them personally, to their political forces, to their power. Even so, this is a negative continuation of this war, which is again would end in defeat for West and for Ukraine, would have more negative consequences to their countries and to people in these countries. So I think this is a very clear choice, and outcome is also very clear. Even so, there was a propaganda which denies this and tries to still argues that you could win this war, or there is a stalemate, or that Russia could be defeated. So I think this is situation which is now need to be admitted, and admission of this outcome would be, I think, very important and I think Trump already stated this, that he also believes that Ukraine is not going to be able to win this war for the reasons which I described. So I think this is important to recognize this, and avoid negative consequences which is already there, and it would be still not possible to reverse this outcome and restore lives of many people who were killed in this war, which could have been easily prevented and avoided.
How would a realistic peace deal look like?
I think a realistic peace deal would most likely be based on most Russian demands, because Russia is winning this war, so it would be able to dictate peace deal terms. not all of them, again, not all Russian demands would be accepted, but I think key demands would be already accepted and would be part of such peace deal, which would include basically non-NATO membership of Ukraine. Was also admitted by Trump, who said that he offered Russia to kind of to recognize that Ukraine would not join NATO. So this is already admitted by Trump, and this was key demand of Russia. Another demand is neutrality of Ukraine, which is, I think, can be linked to NATO membership, but it's not equivalent, which would mean that there will be no Western forces, no Western military, including peacekeepers, by Western countries deployed in Ukraine, because this would mean that Ukraine would not be neutral country. So in this case, I think neutrality also a key demand, and it would be likely part of such peace deal. Another kind of issues would be basically recognition de facto or de jure again, but I don't think de jure, but de facto recognition of Russian control or Russian annexation of Donbass and Kherson and Zaporizhia region. But I think most likely this would be only kind of a part of the regions which are controlled by Russia or occupied by Russia or kind of already annexed by Russia, with exception of parts of these regions which are controlled by Ukraine, because Russia demanded all these regions in control of kind of in borders of Ukrainian regions, including parts of these regions which are controlled by Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian government. But this is not very likely. But I think this will be also part of a peace deal. The only question is again, what would be a Russian kind of control over these regions and how much Russia will be able to occupy or take control over these regions before such peace deal would be finalized and accepted, because Russia slowly takes control over parts of Donbass and some other regions of Ukraine. Um, so Russia advances, but this is now a slow advance, but it can escalate into a bigger one if war continues and Ukraine would lose United States military support. So I think these are key elements of such peace deal. There are other elements which will be including, for instance, security guarantees from the West, which is not likely to happen. There is also issue of demilitarization, kind of Ukraine, which is I'm not sure if it would be. Uh, if Ukraine would accept this, which can be kind of result and I think accepted by Russia. I think another issue is basically kind of a role of far right formations like Azov, which is Russia claims this is denazification of Ukraine, but I think again this is kind of would be a major issue, far right and Nazi organizations, if this would continue or not, because Russia claims that Ukraine is Nazi state, but even Ukraine is not Nazi state, but there is a real and very influential and powerful far right movements, and including open neo-Nazis, which now have control over their own military formations and have power to overthrow Zelensky and block any peace deal, as they did this before. So in this, I think, case, this is, I think, major terms of such peace deal, which would be already, I think, were close to being finalized in Istanbul agreements, in peace deal agreement in spring of 2022, but were blocked by the West. And now, in addition to this, you can, with the exception of control of Russia, of kind of territory of Ukraine, which now Russia would demand again Ukraine to recognize in any peace deal, and Trump already kind of offered to basically a peace deal proposal which would recognize Crimea as de jure as Russia, part of Russia, and de facto would recognize Russian control over occupied parts of Donbass regions and over parts of Russian occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia region along front line, with exception of some territory of Ukraine, which would be returned again from Russian occupation to control of Ukraine in Kharkiv region and Nikolaev region. So this is, I think, already recognition basically of potential key elements of such peace deal, which can be again accepted and and by all sides, but obviously not all sides would be satisfied with such a peace deal. But I think this is much better outcome than continuation of this war, because specifically for Ukraine and for the West, because the longer war would continue, the worse terms for peace deal would be, and even Russia might be able, if this war would continue, even try to kind of achieve a total capitulation of Ukraine, which is not likely, to happen. Russia would not be able to occupy entire territory of Ukraine, but it would be, I think, able to dictate much harsh conditions in terms of any peace deal if the war would continue, and Ukraine would not be able to resist because of a lack of Western military support and because of war of attrition, which would be again would have a cascading negative effect on Ukrainian ability to resist and continue fighting against much more powerful Russian forces.
Why is it that the Russian why is it that the Trump administration seemed to have a much more reasonable approach to the conflict than the previous administration? Why?
I think this is based on American policy, kind of a Trump policy. He kind of because even Trump policy in terms of ending this war, he made ending of war in Ukraine a key part of his election program. And after he was elected and become president of the United States, he tried to actively promote peaceful resolution of this conflict, which was in contrast to policy not only of Democratic Party and not and specifically Biden administration, which was kind of just trying to use Ukraine in proxy war with Russia, but this was also against kind of dominant views of his own Republican Party, because in U.S. Congress, Republicans basically supported all the policy of Biden administration in U.S. Congress, um, kind of voting for all this military support and all sanctions and so on against Russia during Biden administration. Only Trump, after he was elected, he was able to sway this not only policy of the United States, but also policy and kind of policy position of the Republican Party, whose members now support Trump in the U.S. Congress and and specifically concerning ending of this war. So I think this is just Trump. This can be credited to Trump because of his kind of one perspective on his personality and also his kind of views, in which he says that the United States needs to focus on kind of making again America kind of resolving conflicts in the world and kind of without war, and also trying to kind of have peaceful resolution of such conflicts and also try to focus on domestic issues. So he kind of in this case he is much less militaristic and kind of an how to say pro-war compared to even Republicans and especially compare also to even compared to European Union leaders of European Union countries like Macron and British prime ministers and German chancellors, and compared to even heads of European Union, and also compared to kind of Biden administration. So I think this is just personality of Trump and people whom he selected for his administration, like his vice president Vance and like Elon Musk and others who kind of who try to end this war. But I think they still kind of um, I'm not sure if they would be able to succeed because there's still opposition to doing this, and there's kind of and already there's signs that Trump is not successful in his promise to end this war again in one day after his inauguration, and also even 100 days. So I think it will be a very tough conflict to end this. Specifically, Trump can also change his view and change his policy, but I don't think that he would try to make this war his own war, because he calls this Biden war, and this is another reason why he wants to end this war, because he just tries to distance himself from this war, which was kind of supported by Biden administration, and he defeated Biden, and later kind of Kamala Harris, who replaced Biden, kind of in elections. So this is why he tries to distance himself from this conflict, and I think this is kind of real possibility that Trump would have significant effect on peaceful resolution of this conflict, because otherwise this war could have continued. But I think still there is possibility that he would fail and the war would continue, but not very long, because without United States support, without Donald Trump supporting Ukraine with new weapons, with again intelligence and so on, Ukraine will not be able to resist Russia for very long time. So this is, I think, the issue is that Trump has a key kind of leverage on Ukraine, specifically using support of Ukraine and using client state of Zelensky, client status of Zelensky to make Ukraine kind of to accept a peace deal, um, to accept peaceful resolution of this conflict, and he already proposed such peace plan, and I think this is a real possibility that the war would end under during Trump administration. But again, there is no certainty in this case because now Russia wants to continue this war again because they are winning this conflict unless Trump and unless Zelensky would accept Russian demands, again, they would. Again, they have incentive to continue this war because winning, Russia is winning, and again, Zelensky does not want to accept this peaceful resolution because this would mean that he would lose power, and this also position in the United States, democratic opposition, and potentially Republicans also might change their view and support continuing this war. Again, which is not possible, even so, it's not possible for Ukraine to win this war and defeat Russia. But again, this is just a part of policy. So I think Trump administration is kind of is very important kind of in this case because they changed this policy radically. But the question is still if they will be able to succeed in ending this war. And again, I was hopeful that this will be a real possibility, and there's still a real possibility of doing this. But the longer they are not able to do this, the longer kind of become the longer odds kind of become that this war would continue. So I think still we can see if this war would end soon, because with a peaceful resolution, or if it would be continue, and there's a real possibility of even bigger defeat of Ukraine with much more negative and catastrophic consequences for Ukraine and the West.
Last question. What do you make of Zelensky's proposal to meet Vladimir Putin in Istanbul this Thursday?
I think Zelensky accepted this offer of Putin of direct talks between Ukraine and Russia, um, only because this was support this peace talks direct peace talks were supported by Donald Trump. So again, Zelensky opposed such peace talks with Russia, and even he issued a decree of in September of 2022, which prohibited any talks with Russia. So so he still this decree is still not repealed, and so he prohibited any talks with Russia. But now he accepted this in reversal of his previous position when he rejected such peace talks with Russia. He demanded ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, basically, which Russia rejected. And so this decision, basically, this proposal by Zelensky to meet with Putin in Istanbul is, I think, is just a public relations move or kind of theatrical performance to kind of try to make these negotiations kind of fail. Because it's not likely that Putin would attempt and meet with Zelensky, because Putin said that he does not recognize Zelensky as a legal president of Ukraine because of expiration of his presidential term, which is again not specified in the constitution. And also, Putin is not likely to meet with Zelensky, kind of to have similar kind of performance as kind of conflict, open conflict, televised live on cameras and so on publicly, as happened with Zelensky and Donald Trump during a visit of Zelensky to Oval Office. So this is kind of a tactic by Zelensky, basically used to kind of to make this negotiations public and to just to kind of present himself as kind of as still as in charge and still winning this war and so on, for propaganda reasons or for personal public relations reasons, which he had done since the start of this war. So instead of kind of kind of trying to resolve this conflict, he uses a variety of tactics to continue this war by basically accepting this dark peace talks with Russia, but making these conditions are not realistic by saying that he only would meet with Putin, kind of, and this would mean that he likely to reject kind of other members of Russian delegation, which Putin said that he would send. And but I think this can still change if there's an involvement of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump said that he might go to Istanbul if there will be a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. So there's possibility that there might be some late minute talks between Putin and Trump, in which they might agree for some kind of peace deal, and then there is possibility that Putin will attend this peace talks if Trump would be present. But I think otherwise, still, I think it would be kind of. I'm not optimistic that such talks between Putin and Zelensky will take place for the reasons which I mentioned, but also because typically peace talks would require fast negotiations between delegations in which you have all the agreements basically signed and agreed before meeting between leaders of the countries. So first you need to have negotiations to have text of agreement or kind of or close to being finalized, as happened in Istanbul, because there was a real possibility of meeting between Zelensky and Putin in spring of 2022 to finalize agreement, which was already negotiated between Ukrainian and Russian delegations after several rounds of negotiations, and you have a written document basically, which was initialed by Ukrainian side. So there was already such agreement. In this case, in the case of now talks between Russia and Ukraine, there are no such written text of agreement which would have been accepted by both Russia and Ukraine. So I don't think this is like a real possibility of Putin and Zelensky meeting and ending this war. And Zelensky basically proposal is just another kind of public relations move, which he kind of tactical move in order to kind of just basically derail such peace talks and prevent this war from ending, because this is not beneficial for him. He basically would lose power and would lose even kind of his maybe freedom, and there's even possibility of losing his life if he would again if the war would end, or if he would sign a peace deal, because of far right backlash, and this possibility that he might be even again overthrown by the far right if he would sign such peace deal with Russia on Russian terms, or kind of or recognize even de facto Russian control over territories of Ukraine, because this is again kind of a major issue in Ukrainian politics, and not, even so now there is no opposition to this, so there is still a very significant far right movement, and now they have control over military information, so they can overthrow Zelensky if he would again go against their own views and their own kind of ideology. So I think this is why one of the reasons why Zelensky also reluctant to have negotiations basically, and he prefers to have this kind of tactics as he did in the Oval Office with Trump. So he basically tries to repeat this with Putin, but I don't think this kind of Putin would accept this, and Putin again just offered this kind of direct peace talks, also in order to kind of respond to this ceasefire proposal, which was presented by leaders of European Union countries and Zelensky as basically ultimatum. And so this is basically each side now does this publicly, and typical peace talks to end the war happen in secret. And so and this is, I think, very negative, has a negative impact when you have all these public statements about peace talks, because kind of real peace talks would also require quiet and kind of secret, kind of to be negotiated in secret, and only later publicized when this agreement basically will be ready, because otherwise it will be very difficult to achieve any peaceful resolution of any conflict if you have public discussion about various elements of peace talks, and who would be present and what kind of agreement would be involved in each case, because this is obviously has negative consequences to each side. So that's why kind of I'm skeptical that this proposal by Zelensky would mean a real meeting with Putin and ending this war, unless there is some kind of involvement of Donald Trump, and there is a real kind of agreement between Donald Trump and Putin. And I think this is still the most important positions. If they decide to end this war, if they decide to have agreement, they can then Trump can force Zelensky to accept such agreement, and then we can have possibility of a peaceful deal. But I don't have any such information that there is such possibility right now.
Professor Dr. Ivan Katchanovski, thank you so much for your deep insight and being truly a blessing to myself and really to the world.
Thank you.
Ivan Katchanovski. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to